This lecture will cover physical and cognitive development in early childhood. On this slide, we have a picture of a child in early childhood, somewhere between the ages of 2 and 6, probably somewhere in the middle of that, around the age of 4 or 5, putting together some pieces. And so this picture is meant to illustrate the learning process that children begin to experience in early childhood. With regard to physical development, we will discuss body and brain growth, some of the typical patterns associated with early childhood development. We'll look at motor development and discuss the difference between fine and gross motor skills. We'll look at typical sleep patterns, not just in early childhood, but throughout various stages of life, and see how they change, including how REM stage sleep patterns change. We'll also look at nutrition and exercise in early childhood, as well as illness and death related issues in early childhood. Body growth in early childhood is a continuous, steady development that occurs with about 2 to 3 inches per year and about 6 to 7 pounds in addition to that every year. So therefore, it would be abnormal for a child to gain 10 pounds between the ages of 3 and 4. Or it would also be abnormal for a child to only gain 4 pounds between the ages of 3 and 4. And there are children that face both of those types of issues. There are some children that grow at a too fast of a rate, probably because of their diet, and we have some children that are growing at a much slower rate, and there are other factors to consider, such as ethnicity, their nutrition, and growth hormone deficiency. So certainly with regard to ethnicity, there are certain ethnicities that are just larger on average than others. So you look at Asian American population, or just Asian population in general, they tend to be a little bit smaller. So it would be probably more likely to be expected that these children maybe grow 5 to 6 pounds per year as opposed to 8 or 9 pounds per year, which might be more in line with other ethnicities and other cultures. And a lot of that has to do with our nutrition as well. Of course, there are certain groups that are experiencing poverty, and therefore their nutrition just isn't as appropriate as it should be, and so therefore those children can be underweight. There are also some children that suffer from growth hormone deficiency, and so these individuals lack a hormone that is stimulated by the pituitary gland of the endocrine glandular system, and that basically prevents them from putting on weight and growing. Of course, we can treat that with hormone replacement therapy. It just needs to be identified as early as possible, and that's a common phrase that you'll see in terms of childcare and in both in healthcare as well as mental health care. Early detection is key. When we can detect a problem early, we can provide early intervention, whether the issue be related to physical growth or it may be related towards a cognitive ability such as reading. And so therefore it's important to establish norms. It's important to establish and understand what is considered normal or typical or average. And if we're saying that during early childhood children grow on average 6 to 7 pounds per year, it's probably not much of a concern if a child only gains 5 pounds or if a child gains 8 pounds. However, once we get to extreme distances from that average or that mean, and we see a child that's only gaining 3 pounds in a year or a child that's gaining 11 pounds in a year, that's a cause for concern, and early detection in those kinds of situations is key. The picture on the right shows basically a graph that shows how as age increases, so does weight and height, of course, throughout the first 2 years of life, and also basically, and actually through the first 12 years of life, and shows the kind of car seats that children are expected to have. And so there are 3 different types of car seats. We have rear-facing car seats, and these are types of car seats are used specifically for children between the ages of 0 and 4. Then we have forward-facing seats for children that are a little bit larger. Some children as early as age 3 can start using this. And then eventually children get so large that they need to be using a booster seat. And as you can see, that's typically reserved for children that are around 7 years of age. Now, this graph provides very strict cutoffs, and so there's certainly some room for variability between children. Every child is unique, and so they may be ready for a booster seat sooner rather than later, depending on their size, really. This slide just really shows a change that occurred in child restraint laws that went into effect at the beginning of the year 2019, which it seems like it was very long ago now. The purpose of this slide is basically to show that social policy or government policy changed, and where it wasn't so much focused on the size of the child, the law was more strict and basically showed that the age of the child was going to define basically more so when what kind of seat that they use, whether it be a rear facing, a front facing, or a booster seat. With regard to brain growth, the brain reaches about 90% of adult size by the age of 5. So that's one of the reasons why children in early childhood, their head sometimes seems disproportional to their body. Their head seems almost like an adult-sized head compared to their body, because the brain is very big at this point, and so therefore it needs a lot of space, and therefore that's why children have a kind of what seems like a disproportionately large head to the rest of their body. Although the brain has reached about 90% of the adult size, it certainly has not reached the full potential of an adult brain in terms of the neuronal connections that exist, which essentially are the foundation of all aspects of our knowledge and our psychology. There are a lot of changes that are still occurring in the brain that will continue to happen throughout middle childhood and adolescence. What we see is that during early childhood, we see rapid spurts of growth in the frontal lobes. So the frontal lobe is responsible for decision making as well as impulse control. And understand that, children during the ages of 2 and 3 are very impulsive. They lack the ability and they struggle to understand the consequences of their actions. And so by teaching them impulse control and teaching them patience, that is essentially assisting in the development of the frontal lobe. This is also facilitated by myelination. Myelin is basically it's a fatty substance, it's a type of insulin that wraps around the axon of the neurons, and this essentially makes sure that the electrical impulse is smooth and consistent. This facilitates neuronal communication, and so therefore that assists us in essentially navigating our psychology a lot easier, being able to think quicker and think clearer, being able to execute our movements and make decisions quicker. All of that is facilitated by neuronal communication, which is assisted by myelination. The thicker the myelin, the better. And so we see a lot of growth of myelin, and we see just general mass growth in the frontal lobes. So with regard to physical development, motor development is a subtopic of that. And when we discuss motor development, there's really two categories of it. There's gross motor skills. These are skills that involve larger muscle groups like our legs and our arms. And this is more commonly associated with accidents, because as children gain strength in these gross motor skills, or these gross motor skills advance, they are more prone towards climbing and running and jumping and moving. And so that basically is going to be associated with different types of accidents. We certainly want to encourage physical activity and movement, but at the same time, it's important to be cautious, because again, and this relates back to the fact that children's brains are still learning and still changing, and so many of them still lack a great deal of impulse control, and so they may run without thinking about the consequences of them running. And so you take a very simple concept like teaching a child how to cross the street. The reason why we need to teach them is because their first impulse is to cross their street if that's their objective. They don't really think about anything else other than getting to the other side. We need to teach children at a very young age that before they attempt to walk across the street using their gross motor skills, they need to look both ways to see if there's any oncoming traffic. And that discipline of basically thinking, okay, I want to cross the street, is there anything else I need to consider in this action? Of course, that involves looking both ways, but just understand that that is a skill that is learned, and that is something that we must teach our children to do. And for many of them, it takes repeated pairings. We need to teach it to them and explain it to them several times. Fine motor skills, these skills involve smaller muscle groups like our fingers, and so it is during this age where children are going to be drawing and writing and using scissors and engaging in all sorts of arts and crafts, and that's really good because that assists in the development of fine motor skills, which will essentially lead to our ability to use tools like hammers and also be able to type and text and those kinds of things. So sleep in early childhood, it's very important for all humans. Humans spend about 25 to 30% of their life asleep. We sleep on average about 7 to 8 hours a day, but that is only true for, I'd say, people in late adolescence and early adulthood. Granted, there are still variations within those age groups, but what we see is that for 3-year-olds, for example, they typically sleep more like 11 hours a day, as indicated as the graph on the graph there. What you'll see is that daytime sleep or naps are still very common throughout the first 2 to 3 years of life. Of course, there's nothing wrong with taking a nap when you're 10 years old or 20 years old or 70 years old. But just understand that naps are an essential part of development for children in infancy and essentially the first half of early childhood. And so children do need some children younger than the age of 3 and 4. Most of them absolutely need some type of daytime sleep because their brain is experiencing a lot of things, and they're still getting used to being active in their environment. And there's so much for them that they're trying to absorb, and so much that they're trying to do. So some of the common problems of sleep include insomnia and nightmares. And so even adults face these issues like insomnia and nightmares, but adults have a much better ability to communicate these issues and understand the root and cause of these issues. Children struggle with understanding the root of their nightmares, and when their sleep is disrupted because of nightmares or insomnia, this can lead to other issues like issues with attention. It's important to understand that even in adulthood, maybe even more so in adulthood, when we lack sleep and we're sleep deprived, that affects our attention, that affects our decision making, it affects our memory, and so that can lead towards accidents. That can lead towards motor vehicle accidents, not necessarily by falling asleep at the wheel, but just not being attentive to the situation. It can certainly lead to problems with retaining information if you're trying to study, and it can lead to problems with paying attention to a lecture or a discussion that you're engaged in. What we see is that when people are deprived of sleep and have issues with sleep, that does affect their brain development as well. It affects their brain activity because remember, cognitive functions like attention and memory and decision making, they are linked to brain development. They coincide with one another and they work together. And then we also see that sleep problems are also associated with being overweight. If we are sleep deprived, typically that means that the next day we're going to be sluggish. We're going to be tired, and we're not going to be very active. And so when we have those kinds of patterns, that lack of activity and sluggishness, that typically leads towards being overweight, or that can lead to being overweight. And I think that's also associated with attention problems and decision making, especially for adults. We are constantly having to make conscious decisions about what we eat, and if we're sleep deprived or we have issues with our sleep, that affects our ability to make good decisions. But I do want to go back quickly a few slides because when we were talking about body growth and we were looking at these images here and discussing typical body growth of children, there was an image here of a kid's healthy eating plate, and which I didn't get to, but what you'll see is that it's essentially a graphic of a plate that illustrates some vegetables and some implements the idea of what breads are, their grains, and kind of emphasizes the importance of water and fruits and healthy proteins. It's important to understand that these concepts are beginning to be taught at a very young age in life, because understanding how food works at a more complex level, understanding the difference between good carbs and bad carbs and different types of fats and that kind of stuff, we cannot begin to understand that unless we understand the basic concept of what is a fat and what is a grain and what is a healthy type of protein, and what are good choices for beverages like water. When we learn these foundations, these basics, that allows us to learn the complexity of nutrition. And so what I'm saying is that it's just important to begin teaching these concepts to children during early childhood, at the ages of 3 or 4. And again, they may not understand it immediately, but with repeated exposure to the concepts, eventually they will form those connections. And the earlier we expose it to them, the sooner they will form those connections. Oh, one more thing here. bedtimes. Bedtimes are very important for people of all ages, I believe. It provides a sense of consistency, and it sets what we refer to in psychology as a circadian rhythm, kind of a 24-hour biological cycle that our bodies go through. And if we lack consistency in our sleep schedule, that basically prevents us from establishing a consistent circadian rhythm. But as we see, children at the ages of 3 or 4, they go to bed very early, somewhere around between 7 and 8 on average. Children that are later in early childhood, around 6, they typically go to bed around 8 o'clock. Now, if a child who's the age of 6 doesn't go to bed till 8:30, is that completely abnormal and completely deviant of these norms? No, it's just slightly abnormal. It's just a slight degree away from what is considered normal. We cannot have normal without some sort of flexibility. So when we look at a normal distribution of scores, typically around 60% of scores fall somewhere in what we consider to be average. So it's safe to say that somewhere around 60% of children are falling asleep around the age of 8 o'clock, somewhere between 7:30 and 8:30. If you have a 6-year-old who's not falling asleep until 9:30, that's just not normal. That in itself might not be a major cause for concern, because we have differences in culture, and we have to consider whether or not school is happening the next day, those kinds of things. But just in general, understand that it's expected that children should have a bedtime. When I say it's expected, it's highly recommended by psychologists. So next thing we'll discuss is nutrition and exercise. I was discussing about how, we start to learn at a very early age, different food groups and understanding what is a good food and what is a bad food. Although that's only true for some of us. Some children, are never taught those concepts, or if they are, it's kind of too late, because understand that it is during early childhood that we start to develop our taste. We start to develop our preferences. And quite honestly, or the truth of the matter is that there are 3-year-olds out there who have had soda and had that experience and maybe drink soda regularly. And then there are 3-year-olds out there who have never had soda. And then there's a whole spectrum in between of those two children. Or those two types of children. What we do know is that the United States as a culture and as a nation has the second highest rate of childhood obesity in the world. And so that's a really big cause for concern, because, obviously being overweight is linked towards a wide range of health issues. And it's important to understand that the vast majority of children that are overweight as in their youth, in childhood, are going to be overweight adults. Research has demonstrated that, yes, some of them will not be overweight as adults, but the vast majority of overweight children will become overweight adults. And so understanding that having an overweight child is very much setting their future up in terms of their physical development to be poor. We see that childhood obesity is strongly linked to caregivers' behavior, or nutrition and exercise in general is strongly influenced by caregivers' behavior. What does this mean? Well, it's important to understand that throughout early childhood, most of our food options are provided to us by our caregivers. We essentially eat what our parents tell us to do, or what our parents give us. And furthermore, if we see our parents eating ice cream, and we see our parents eating candy and eating potato chips and drinking soda, it's very natural for children to also want to be engaging in those kinds of behaviors as well. We discussed that regarding social learning theory back in chapter 1. So it's very important to understand that children imitate their parents, and children are also susceptible to the choices that are presented to them by their parents. And that's true for both nutrition and exercise. If parents are active and parents are taking the initiative to take their children on walks and take their children to the park and limit their exposure to the TV and the video games, well, then children will essentially fall in line with this behavior. They will essentially follow and imitate this behavior many times because they don't have a choice, in the sense that if you remove their video games and you remove their access to the television and you tell them that you take them to the park, well, then that is just going to provide an opportunity for movement and exercise. And when you're at the park, you have the choice of giving them a soda or giving them a bottle of water. And those kinds of decisions and those kinds of behaviors that you decide to engage in, that is ultimately going to influence the child's nutrition and exercise. The body mass index is a tool that we use as scientists to essentially measure and describe the general physical development in terms of being overweight or underweight for humans. It is not a perfect system by any means, but it is fairly effective and fairly reliable at describing whether or not an individual is at a normal weight range, they are under the normal weight range, they are at risk for being obese, or if they are obese. And so as you can see, there's the ages that are associated with the BMI score on the right, and it shows kind of the percentile mark. So understand that, you know, the 50th percentile basically means that half the people in general are above that and half the people in general are below that. And so we have about 5% of the general population that is underweight, as you can see there at the lowest region at the bottom that's completely white. So those people could stand to gain some weight essentially. And so when you look at how wide, you know, the green zone is and how wide the red zone is, understand that, you know, people can be just, you know, getting into the red zone, or they can be well past the red zone and be basically in the 95th percentile of body weight. Which would essentially be morbidly obese. And so it's important to be able to identify where on this spectrum you land, because I think that the better we can describe and understand where we stand in terms of a distribution of scores, the better we are at being able to make a decision as to where we're going to move in from that, and be able to set realistic goals for us as well. You know, understand that if you are at the higher end of the normal range, you are just that much closer to being at risk for being obese, basically being overweight, and there's only one way to go, or not only one way, but if you continue with that trend, that's essentially going to be linked to obesity. So one of the last things we'll discuss regarding physical development in early childhood are some of the main causes of death. So as you can see, the #1 cause of death in early childhood are motor vehicle accidents. This accounts for 13% of all deaths of children between the ages of 1 and 4 in the United States. Why is that? Well, you know, the truth of the matter is that the motor vehicles are very dangerous. They can be very dangerous when they are essentially driven irresponsibly, or when someone else is driving them irresponsibly. You know, it's very difficult to control for other drivers. We have drunk drivers. We have people who are falling asleep while they're driving. And so just understand that if we have, you know, millions of people driving around at very high speed, and we have, you know, and we're doing that ourselves, and we're driving our children to the grocery store and to the daycare, there's just a chance that, you know, the children can die from a motor vehicle accident. And that's even with the correct type of seats. You know, what we discussed, the importance of having children in a restraint like a booster seat, or a front-facing or a rear-facing car seat. What happens when children aren't in those seats and they get into a car accident? They essentially become projectiles, and so that, I mean, many times it's going to lead to severe injury, if not death. The important thing to understand about motor vehicle accidents is that they are somewhat preventable. Unfortunately, we have other issues like cancer and cardiovascular diseases. Many of these are congenital. They have a genetic basis to them, and so many of them, you know, these things we can't really prevent. We can offer some type of treatment to them, and I think that, you know, that basically, if we're talking about treating these issues like cancer and cardiovascular diseases and influenza, septicemia, these kinds of things, you know, it's important to understand that, you know, healthcare comes into play. What kind of healthcare access do these children have access to? What kind of healthcare do they have access to? What socioeconomic status are they in, and how is that going to affect their ability to pay for treatment? Do they have health insurance? And so these social policies, these government issues, and social policies, I should call them, things like insurance, things like healthcare, you know, understand that these things do influence children in some way, shape, or form. And then the only cause of death that I didn't reference was firearms. As you can see, it counts for only 1% of deaths in the United States of children that are ages of 1 to 4. But I mean, when you think about it, basically what we're saying is, if 100 children between the ages of 1 and 4 die, basically one of those 100 children died because of a firearm. And I'm not saying anything good about firearms or bad about firearms or what purpose they serve. But the question is this one death preventable in any way, shape, or form? Can it be prevented in any way, shape, or form? Especially compared to like cancer, cardiovascular disease. Like I said, some of these deaths cannot be prevented. Can a death by firearm for a child who's 2 years old, can that be prevented? Moving on to cognitive development. We will be discussing Piaget's pre-operational stage of cognitive development. This occurs between the ages of 2 and 7. We will then discuss Vygotsky's sociocultural theory of cognitive development, information processing theory. We'll also discuss language development and early childhood education. Let's begin with Piaget's pre-operational stage of cognitive development. It's the second stage of his theory. It takes place between the ages of 2 and 7. So it is during this life stage of early childhood that we see significant cognitive developments. We see a lot of growth. We see a lot of changes. We see a lot of cognitive functions that are unique to this age group as well. The first major accomplishment that we see in early childhood, according to Jean Piaget, is a cognitive ability known as symbolic representation. What symbolic representation involves is the use of symbols. And a symbol can be a word, it can be a picture, or it can be a behavior that is meant to communicate an idea. So, do 10-month-old humans have words? Do they speak words? The vast majority of them do not. And if they do, it's very, very few. Do 10-month-olds have the ability to draw pictures? Do 10-month-olds have the ability to look at a picture and be able to understand what that picture represents? And what kind of behaviors do 10-month-old babies, 10-month-old humans, what kind of behaviors do they have that they can use to communicate their ideas other than crying, essentially, or smiling? Because that's really more communicating an emotion rather than idea. But a child at the ages of 3 and 4, they can speak many words. They can read many words. They can write words. And they can use these words to communicate their ideas, what it is that they're thinking about. They can draw pictures, like the picture shown on the bottom left. Understand that this picture contains symbols, and a drawing like this is not capable of a 1-year-old child. This is something that only begins to occur somewhere in early childhood. Whether it be 2, 3, or 4, that's debatable, but we understand that a 1-year-old is not going to be able to produce this kind of image. And all of these images within the drawing are symbols. The person on the left in the yellow dress might represent mom. The person in the blue might represent dad with a tie. Obviously, we have a sun, some clouds, some grass, a house. All of these are symbols that represent ideas that exist in the child's mind. And then, of course, we have behaviors. You think of some of the behaviors or gestures, that might be a better phrase, that children use to communicate. Waving, for example, waving hi, waving bye. Do many 10-month-old babies wave hi and bye? Some might. But certainly a 2-year-old has that ability. Giving a thumbs up, giving a high five. Do you think a 10-month-old human can give a high five? That kind of gesture, that kind of behavior is meant to basically communicate some sort of relationship or some type of connection between two individuals. A child at the age of 2 might basically make a gesture with their hand that kind of looks like a gun. Maybe not the age of 2, maybe a little bit later in early childhood, around the age of 5 or 6, and may say things like bang bang. That kind of behavior, that kind of gesture is a symbol that represents an object like a gun. Egocentrism. This is another characteristic of Jean Piaget's pre-operational stage of cognitive development. However, this is a type of limitation that we see in the cognitive ability of children. Children in early childhood, they tend to be egocentric. What that means is that they struggle in understanding the thoughts, the feelings, and the general perspective of others. Being able to understand the thoughts, feelings, and general perspective of others involves experience. It involves life experience, and it occurs throughout the lifespan. However, because children have such little experience in interacting socially, they struggle with understanding how other people might be thinking, feeling. Sometimes they will unknowingly, annoy people because they don't understand that, the level that they are speaking or yelling is essentially annoying to other people. They don't understand that. They might block someone's view of the television, and they don't understand that that's rude because they do not have the ability to put themselves in the position of the other person yet. They can gain that ability through life experience when other people end up blocking their view, or when other people are distracting them or annoying them. And also they can learn from these experiences through communication with adults or caregivers when we teach them and talk to them and say, well, how do you think it feels to have that? How do you think that child feels because that child does not have a toy? How do why do you feel sad? And so being able to ask a child to communicate their thoughts and their feelings, and basically give them an opportunity to, or prompt them to think about how someone else might think and feel, that is essentially going to help them develop that skill and overcome egocentrism. Animism is a characteristic in the way that young children think. They have a tendency to project thoughts and feelings into inanimate objects, much like the picture we see here of a child with a doll. She's feeding the doll. And so we understand what playing pretend involves, make believe, that kind of stuff. And we are able to understand that a doll that's made of plastic does not have thoughts or feelings. And so we are able to emotionally detach ourselves from these inanimate objects. Children at the age of 3 and 4, and maybe even later beyond that, some of them, I want to say the word struggle to be able to understand that these inanimate objects do not have thoughts and feelings. And I say struggle, but it's one of the things that you can actually use to your advantage, because if a child is exhibiting fear about a particular situation, you can use an inanimate object like a doll or a teddy bear, and you can ask them, does this teddy bear, does this doll look scared? They don't, they can basically look towards someone else to identify with, like a doll or a teddy bear, and you can tell them, look, the teddy bear is not scared, look, the doll is not scared, so you don't need to be scared either. Now, on an adult, that's not likely going to work, because we understand that the doll and the teddy bear truly have no thoughts and feelings of their own. But young children, they do tend to think this way, and we identify that as animism. One of the biggest contributions that Piaget's theory of cognitive development made was the idea that children at the age of 2 and 3, they lack an understanding of conservation. Conservation involves understanding physical changes in matter. And so we have two images on the far bottom right here. So on the first images, we have two containers of water that seem to be pretty much level. They seem to contain the same amount of water. And if you present these two glasses of water to a child who's 3 or 4, many of them will likely say that it has the same amount of water. What we can do then is, in front of the child, pour the water from one of the containers into a different shaped container, like what you see here that's in the container that's labeled C. And then you can ask them which of the two containers has more water. Many children will answer with C. Excuse me, many children will tell you that they believe that the water container that basically has a higher water line has more water, because they are essentially fixated on the height of the water as being the determining factor of whether or not a container has more water than another. They do not understand that just because a physical object changes the way that it looks, that doesn't mean that it maintains certain elements like mass or volume. And so there's a lot of different conservation tasks that are used on children to demonstrate whether or not they have gained this understanding. They will eventually gain this understanding just with experience. One of the things we can do is pour the water back into the original container and teach them and tell them, and so they can see, look, it's actually the same amount. Just because it looks different, that doesn't mean that there's more or less. However, you can also use this lack of understanding to your advantage, because if you have a child who's quote unquote very, very hungry, you can take like a slice of pizza and you can cut it in half into 2 pieces, and many times they will believe that they have more pizza than they had initially, because now they have 2 pieces compared to 1, even though it's still the same amount of pizza by mass. So Piaget's theory of cognitive development, it's broken up into 4 different stages, and so it's a form of discontinuous development. He has some major developments that occur in stage 1, and then we have some major developments that occur in stage 2, and they're not really tied to the developments in stage 1, or at least the theory doesn't explain how they're tied to stage 1, so on and so forth. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory of cognitive development is just a different perspective on cognitive development. It's not better or worse, it's just different. It's just complementary, and if anything, it has more of a continuous approach. There's no stages in his theory. His biggest contribution of his theory is the identification of something called the zone of proximal development. So the zone of proximal development is essentially a sweet spot in terms of difficulty of a task that a child can master with support from an instructor. And so the important thing to understand is that if a task is very, very difficult, and the child cannot master the task or learn the task or complete the task even with help of an instructor or a teacher or a coach or a guide or a parent, then that task is outside of the zone of proximal development, and therefore this is not conducive to cognitive development. Children are not learning when they are trying to accomplish a task that is too challenging for them to master even with support. Conversely, if a child can easily master a task and they are repeating that task over and over and over again and mastering it over and over and over again on their own without the assistance of anyone else, that task is also outside of their zone of proximal development. They are not experiencing cognitive development because the task is too easy. They are not being challenged enough. And so it's important to identify that range of difficulty that is difficult enough that they can accomplish with support from a guide or a teacher. Scaffolding is the process by which a guide, teacher, or learner changes, not the learner, the guide, the teacher, or the instructor, or the parent changes the level of support. And so when they see that a child is struggling, they offer support. And if the child continues to struggle, they offer more support until it reaches a point where you may have to change not only the level of support, but change the level of difficulty as well. If you are going to, for example, read with a child, what you want them to do is try to read as many words as possible. And when they reach and when they reach a word that they cannot read and they struggle with, at that point and only at that point should you interject and say, sound out the word. What is the first letter? What sound does that first letter make? And by assisting them with that, and maybe even eventually saying the word for them and asking them to repeat that, all of that is changing the amount of support that you can. But of course, you also have to give them an opportunity to try and accomplish it on their own with each level of support that you add. One of the other things that Vygotsky noted about children is that they guide their behavior, especially with complex tasks, using something as private speech. Private speech is essentially children talking to, well, not necessarily for children, but that's when we see it begin to occur and develop, is in early childhood. It's what we do as humans when we're engaging in a very complex task. And so what we essentially just speak out loud to ourselves, and we talk ourselves through the steps necessary that are required to complete the task. That's known as private speech. It's very, very common in early childhood. You'll hear a child doing something, maybe playing with their toys and saying, I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this, and then this happens, and then I do this. That is all private speech. They're not talking to you. They're talking to themselves. Eventually, what happens is inner speech develops. Inner speech is essentially the ability to internalize those thoughts and be able to essentially suppress that vocalization. Information processing theory is another perspective of cognitive development. It's also a form of continuous development in that there are no stages here. The cognitive abilities that information processing outlines are things like attention, short-term memory, as well as executive functioning, which is an umbrella term that contains all sorts of other cognitive abilities. We'll begin with attention. Attention is simply described as focusing mental resources on a select information, focusing on an object, focusing on a word, focusing on a stimulus, focusing on a person. That is a skill that continues to develop throughout early childhood. Our attention span increases throughout early childhood and into adulthood. As we become more advanced humans in terms of our cognitive functioning, we learn to divide our attention. We have the ability to attend to certain things for an extended period of time, longer and longer and longer. And so it just continuously gets more advanced. There's not a major change that occurs. It's just slow, steady, continuous development. Short-term memory, this is a part of our cognitive functioning in which we are able to think about or retain a specific piece of information for about 30 seconds with no rehearsal. What that means is that once something enters our attention, we believe that it has entered our short-term memory. We can only think about 7 different things at any given time. In adulthood, for children, is probably much lower. And what ends up happening is that once a new concept enters our mind, it's likely going to force out one of the other 7 concepts. And that other concept that is forced out, within 30 seconds, it's likely to be essentially banished from our short-term memory, and we're not going to be able to bring it back in without some sort of assistance, without some sort of cue or stimulus. And so that's one of the reasons why it's very easy for us to get distracted and forget what it was that we were doing. You might go to the kitchen to get something to drink, and then someone distracts you and asks you a question, and you talk to them for about 30 seconds, and then they say, okay, thank you. And then you think back, you realize that the conversation is over, but 30 seconds have gone by, and you can't remember what it was that you went to the kitchen for. That's because it's essentially exited your short-term memory. What ends up happening during that time, though, is you may look around the kitchen, and then you may see the refrigerator, or you may see the water bottle that you went to get. And so that refrigerator, that water bottle essentially enters your attention and enters your short-term memory, and then you're able to attend to it again. But only if you're able to identify it from a sensory standpoint, only if you're able to see it. Or maybe the person that distracted you tells you, reminds you what it was that you were thinking about. Executive functioning. So executive functioning is basically a part of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is part of the frontal lobe. It's the part that's most forward in our brain, right behind our forehead. It's responsible for a lot of the higher order functions that we as humans are capable of, like planning our actions, thinking about what it is that we're going to do throughout the day or the weekend, being able to detect errors. So for example, if we're maybe writing an essay and we're trying to think about, a word and it looks wrong, basically we're able to identify that the word is misspelled. We're able to identify that something is wrong with the way that something tastes. We're able to identify that maybe an outfit doesn't match. All of that is thinking that occurs in the prefrontal cortex, and it's part of executive functioning. And so the better skilled someone is at planning their actions, at identifying problems and detecting errors, essentially the more advanced they are, kind of like the more intelligent they are when you think about it. They're able to identify problems and solve them. They're also able to identify how far along they are in completing tasks or solving problems. That's known as monitoring progress. So if you're writing an essay and you're able to gauge, whether or not you just started or you're almost done or you're about halfway done, that kind of thinking is part of your executive functioning. And then, of course, impulse control. I was telling you that, children in early childhood are very impulsive. They don't think about their actions. They basically just start executing their actions. They don't think about the consequences of them. They don't think about what comes next or what happens if this happens. They just act on impulse. As we get older and as our prefrontal cortex grows and as myelination occurs and as we have more life experience, we develop more impulse control. But it is a task. It is a skill that needs to be developed and needs to be trained. What we see is that children who are diagnosed with ADHD, who struggle with impulse control, they tend to have a smaller than average prefrontal cortex than the rest of their peers. We also see that the younger children in the classroom are more likely to struggle with impulse control and more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD because their brains are just not as developed as the rest of their peers because they are younger. We discussed egocentrism with regard to Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Theory of mind is a term that's provided to us by information processing theory that is essentially the opposite of egocentrism. It is the ability to understand the thoughts, feelings, and experiences of others. So it is true to say that children in early childhood, they lack theory of mind because they are egocentric. So theory of mind develops with experience, social interactions. And as we get older, we begin to understand that not everyone thinks and feels the same way that we do. One of the ways that we can test for theory of mind is using the false belief test. False belief test is when we show a child a box of crayons and we ask him or her, the young child, at the ages of 3 or 4, what do you think is inside the box of crayons? the vast majority of them are likely going to say crayons because they think that a box of crayons has crayons inside. I think it's very logical. I don't understand why anyone would think there's anything else other than crayons. However, this is an experiment, and as a psychologist, we have, you know, a trick up our sleeves all the time. And what's actually in the crayon box are candles. And this is a big surprise to the child. We show them, look, it's actually candles. And they say, oh my goodness. And they're very shocked. Why would there be candles inside a crayon box? And then what we do then is we ask them, hey, this other person who didn't see the crayons, you know, they just got here, you know, what do you think they think is in the box? And the child will say, I think that they think there's candles in the box. And again, it's why would anyone think that there are candles inside a crayon box unless they saw it for themselves? You know, so they struggle with separating what they've seen and what they've experienced with the thoughts and experiences of other people. People with autism often struggle with theory of mind. Many of them remain egocentric throughout adolescence and into adulthood. They struggle with understanding the thoughts, the feelings, and the experiences of others, the perspective of other people. I know a woman who has a nephew or grandson, excuse me, and he's a teenager. He's an adolescent, and he has autism. He has mild autism, but he struggles with theory of mind. To give you an example of such, he wanted to have a surprise birthday party. And so obviously the concept of a surprise birthday party is that everyone knows that, you know, they're having a party for you except the guest of honor. Everyone except the guest of honor knows that there's a party. But him being the guest of honor, he still wanted to have a surprise birthday party because his understanding of a surprise birthday party is everyone, including him, the guest of honor, yelling surprise at the same time. He doesn't understand that, you know, a surprise party is based on the idea that everyone knows something that one person doesn't. So this slide basically has an outline of a bunch of different linguistic abilities that humans begin to develop throughout early childhood. This terminology is very dense. It's very specified to language development. It's very important for people who are going to become reading teachers or people who are going to be educational diagnosticians, being able to understand where or what aspects of speech children are struggling with. And so we won't get into it very much, and we're not going to get into it all actually, and you're not likely to have any sort of questions that test this material. It is during early childhood that children enter early childhood education. And this could vary from kindergarten or Head Start, pre-K, pre-kindergarten, Montessori school. All of these are different options that are available to humans in our culture and our society. It's important that you watch the videos on Montessori School and Project Head Start so that way you understand what these environments look like. They're different from a traditional classroom setting. Understand, though, that all three of these different types of early childhood education are meant to promote all aspects of development: physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional. With regard to physical development, it's important that these programs and these institutions teach our children the importance of exercise and nutrition, because they may not be getting this information at home. They may not be being taught the importance of fruits and vegetables at home. So it's important that these government programs and these private institutions teach children these concepts, and it's important that it provides them with opportunities for physical exercise. It's important that they teach children, that they enhance children's cognitive development with regard to math and reading and general problem solving and science. And it's also important that they promote socio-emotional development as well, that they teach children about emotions. They teach children about appropriate ways to interact with each other, appropriate ways to provide people space, the importance of sharing and caring. All of these basic concepts that we take for granted sometimes, these are taught. And for many children, they are not being taught this at home. And so we must ensure that they are being taught these things in institutions like kindergarten, Montessori school, and Project Head Start. That concludes the lecture on physical and cognitive development in early childhood.